Okay, just while we wait for people to get connected here, I will informally begin the introduction. My name is Scott Butler. I'm the Manager of Policy and Research for another 32 days before I take over as Executive Director here at the Ontario Good Roads Association. This is the latest and the last of the sessions that we've been running during the pandemic, looking at issues that are confronting municipalities across Ontario. Today, we're going to lift our horizon, expand our horizon, and look beyond Ontario's borders. But we're going to look specifically at the challenges rural communities are facing with regards to infrastructure and their infrastructure stewardship. We are very fortunate to be joined today by a panel of people who've given this considerable thought, considerable time and attention. Many of these faces will be familiar to you, but for those that aren't, I assure you, you'll learn something if nothing else happens today. To begin, I am going to turn over to Ashley Whedon and Ryan Gibson. Ryan's the Libro Chair in Rural Economic Development in the School of Environmental Design and Rural Development at the University of Guelph. He has been involved in this project since the inception, and he's been working with now PhD candidate, congratulations, Ashley Whedon, who would be a familiar face to those who've attended the conference in the past, the OGRA conference in the past, or perhaps have a subscription to Municipal World. So I'm not going to belabor the point with any more introductions. I'm going to get out of the way, and I'll turn it over to Ryan, who I think is going to run us through an introduction of the project.
Yeah.
The floor is yours.
Thanks so much for that introduction, and good afternoon to everyone, and thanks for taking the time to join us around this conversation of infrastructure and regional economic development. Everyone's quite busy at the moment, so it's really excited that you're able to join us, and we will make sure that we have this conversation wrapped up so that people can, within the hour, so people can continue on their day on that side of things. My name is Ryan Gibson, as was mentioned, and I'm the Libro Professor of Regional Economic Development at the University of Guelph. And I'm joined this afternoon by an amazing team of colleagues that will share information about this new exciting initiative that includes Ashley Whedon, who's a PhD candidate here at the University of Guelph, Sean Markey, who's a professor at Simon Fraser University, and Jay Maloney, who's a graduate student at Simon Fraser University. And all of us have been working on this exciting initiative. This afternoon's discussion focuses on the interconnection of infrastructure and regional economic development. Both of these topics are no doubt front and center for everybody on this call. These topics are fundamental to local and regional prosperity, and both of these topics are challenged by numbers of factors, such as limited human and financial resources, just to name a few. This afternoon, we'll share an ongoing research initiative with the purpose of investigating these two topics, as well as to put a call to action in terms of engaging the OGRA membership to participate and to provide your own insights in this front. Ashley, are you able to share the slide deck as it's coming up? So this is the name of the formal project, and on the next slide, you'll see that this initiative started in the fall of 2018. And we received funding through the Ontario Agri-Food Innovation Alliance to investigate this relationship between rural infrastructure and regional economic development. In particular, this initiative examines the capacity of rural Ontario communities to respond to infrastructure pressures and opportunities. Now, we recognize right from the onset that the capacity among communities across rural Ontario varies greatly. And as such, we're curious to know how this capacity impacts a community's economic development, both in terms of the short term and the long term. The ultimate goal of this initiative is to provide recommendations to all levels of government in terms of how to maximize the interconnection between rural infrastructure and regional economic development. You'll see on the screen here that this initiative is a collaborative initiative, and the partners are listed on the right-hand side. A wide variety of organizations and government and in nonprofits that have been involved with this. And I'm delighted to say that we've been working with the Ontario Good Roads Association on this initiative, and we've benefited tremendously from hearing the experiences and the insights from OGRA members across the province. one of the things that we're really keen to think about is this notion that infrastructure is being discussed everywhere these days, whether it's related to broadband, natural gas, or post-pandemic recovery. There's a lot of opportunities for infrastructure investments, and a key question becomes how to strategically use these investments in the long term to support economic development, local prosperity. And this is our goal that we'll chat about this afternoon, and a goal that we also hope that you will contribute towards. But perhaps that as an introduction, I'll pass it over to my colleague Sean to share some insights around how we might strategically think about these infrastructure investments as we move forward.
Great, thanks very much, Ryan. I think, certainly one of the ways that we're talking about infrastructure renewal, stimulus spending, things like that in this response to crisis related to COVID is this term shovel-worthy as a balancing out from previous incarnations of the concept being shovel-ready. And I think this has come about for a variety of reasons. First of all, we're in a much different place now in terms of serious considerations of requirements needed to adapt to and respond to climate change. But we also learned very, very valuable lessons associated with the recession and the economic recovery plan from the 2008-2009 period. The Economic Action Plan launched at the time to stimulate and sustain the economy was praised for a variety of reasons. First of all, its speed. Second of all, the extent to which it was able to communicate that Canada had a plan, which had a very important market calming effect. And thirdly, some good things were certainly done with the money. Post-assessments, however, now point that it was also very much a missed opportunity in terms of building a better legacy. One requirement and assessment at the time pointed out that the requirement that projects be shovel-ready meant that projects that could have produced greater long-term benefit were overlooked. So given that, as Ryan articulated this just in the slide previously, that we're in a much different place now, I think, in terms of an awareness of infrastructure needs, an awareness about the extent of infrastructure deficits across the country, and also the extent to which communities, local governments, and regions may have been planning for infrastructure renewal, particularly in light of the 2016 federal election. Are we now in a better position related to COVID stimulus spending to construct and invest in shovel-worthy projects as we seek to respond to the COVID crisis? The next slide there, Ashley. So what do we know? Well, we know that communities, local governments, and regions are dealing with multiple intersecting issues and challenges. Some are deeply entrenched historically in terms of a 30-year period of economic and political restructuring that has put rural communities in a very precarious position in terms of infrastructure deficits owing to a lack of investments and reinvestments in rural communities and regions. We also are in a better position, as I mentioned just a second ago, in terms of forecasting challenges linked with climate change. So we know we have to invest different and invest better. Much of our knowledge base about climate change adaptation, however, and things like green infrastructure continue, however, to be urban oriented. So we have a lot of work to do in terms of thinking about and how to do these projects well and to learn from each other well in terms of investing in rural communities. Policymakers themselves tend also to be urban centric, so they need quality access to information about rural communities and conditions. In essence, we need to co-construct a solution going forward. We need the resources, the jurisdiction, and the authority of senior governments combined with place-based knowledge of rural leaders and stakeholders. And that's something we're really looking forward to doing as a byproduct and outcome of this project. Finally, we know that shovel-worthy projects work. They're going to realize the short-term economic stimulus requirements that governments, senior governments, and local governments are looking for, but also deliver better long-term outcomes for communities in terms of their long-term sustainability and resilience going forward into the future.
So then we have a few questions we actually wanted to ask people about. So I know a lot of webinars, we're all sitting in Zoom a lot these days, and it can feel a little bit one-sided. So if you're accessing this from your laptop or your phone, or no matter what, if you have another device handy, or even just want to open up another window or another tab, if you go to www.menti.com and use the code 822156. There'll be a series of questions come up in the next few minutes, and you can enter them interactive. So it was one of our efforts to try to bring people into the room together while we are apart. So if you want to do that now, you can sort of enter your responses to this question. And we wanted to start with just sort of who's here with us today, so that we kind of have an idea of where we're going and what we're going to talk about. So if you just want to enter in that code 822156 at menti.com, and then as you can see, the first ones come up of Guelph, Ontario. We've got Guelph. We got a lot of Guelphies in the room. That's pretty good. Our networks are pretty strong. I know we've got a few folks.
I haven't even voted yet, so.
We got Oakville, Haldeman. Great.
So just to clarify how superfluous I am to this entire exercise, Ashley's turned the tables on me, but I did want to say at the bottom of your modules where you're watching today, you'll see a Q&A box there. If you have questions for our panelists, I would encourage you to put them in there. I'll do my best to try to beat Ashley to the punch and post them to the rest of the panel. Otherwise, we'll make sure to get through as many of those as we can. Similarly, the chat function's also a way to get a hold of us, and I believe at the Ojari office, we might even have a fax machine at the ready if you're really desperate to get your question in. So anyways, sorry to interject there, Ashley. I was remiss in not mentioning it earlier.
That's A-okay. All the help I can get, I will take it. So we'll let this go for another couple of seconds or so get your answers in. This was just to give us an idea of where folks were coming in from for the day or for the afternoon. And we can kind of see a really interesting spread, certainly across Ontario, but we've got a few folks from other parts of the country as well. So that's really great to see that everybody's making some time in their afternoon to join us. And while our sense is that each rural community faces its own challenges, and there's an adage in the work that we do, which is if you've been to one rural community, you've been to one rural community. They're all very different, and part of our challenge in developing these recommendations and developing our research is communicating the importance that, of course, we think that Edmonton, Montreal, Toronto all require their own unique interventions and policy context when we talk about what they need in order to their immediate challenges or head into the future. But when we tend to talk about rural development or rural policy, we tend to kind of say rural, remote, and First Nations as if it's all one word. And so part of our challenge is finding ways to frame the unique issues that are facing different types of rural communities as their own context, so that we can develop more responsive policy, and as Sean said, more place-based policy that better enables rural communities to look towards their future. So we got a lot of representation from Guelph because it's the biggest word there in the middle, but we do have a really good, strong representation from people from Eastern Ontario, up in the Muskokas, further into Southwestern Ontario, and all the way across the province, as well as across the country in some cases. So thank you for joining us. Our next question is, what's your role in your community? So we understand that staff, elected officials, people in the public sector, but aren't in municipalities or in the private sector, will have different sets of orientations around how best to address challenges and opportunities, different thoughts around the timeline in which they're doing those things, timelines for impact and intention. And so we're always curious about where you situate yourself within your community and how you see yourself as playing a role in the way forward. So far we're seeing a lot of folks from staff, and understandably so. I know that this is high of mind. We've got some elected officials, some non-municipal public sector, and maybe those folks that are in the non-municipal public sector, if you want to throw into the chat where you're from in the non-municipal public sector, that would be awesome for us to kind of capture that. But all of this goes into playing that we're finding that sometimes while municipalities will have sort of a cohesive or unified front in terms of how best to tackle opportunities and challenges coming down the road at them, there's a different orientation in terms of what things take priority. And so we're trying to be sensitive to and understand how these roles play a role, as it were, in the way that we respond to these challenges and opportunities. So we'll just leave that for a couple more seconds, but it looks like the biggest flurry of activity has come in so far. But so whether you're, within government or outside of government will really depend on where you're at in this. And it's important to note that in the context of sort of contemporary rural development and policy, it's not just government kind of the only one on the ship, rowing the ship, or charting the course forward. We really need to have everybody in kind of working towards the same goal. So the more that we can bring different stakeholders into this conversation and talk about what that future looks like, the more successful we're likely to be. So now we're getting more into the questions around what this research project is tackling, which is, what's the biggest capacity challenge related to infrastructure that you're experiencing in your community? And we've set this up to kind of be a rolling scroll of responses. So as you put them in, they'll come up along the screen. But we'd love to know what it is that's affecting your ability to respond to infrastructure and opportunities. Is it human resources? Is it technical capacity in terms of having the skills to be able to seize opportunities as they come along? Is it financial capacity in terms of having the available funding to match initiatives that are going on? In a lot of cases, we've seen municipalities needing, particularly really small municipalities with few staff, have to go to outside consultants in order to build their strategy and then also carry out the work, so that we know that a lot of these things play into each other. Similarly, we do know that when there is a lack of economic development happening in a community, it tends to affect the level of investment in infrastructure and vice versa. So we end up with this sort of vicious cycle. And so one of the questions we have is, how do you turn that around and turn it into a virtuous cycle where you have this interdependent and building forward connection between infrastructure investment and management and capacity building and economic development in a community? So we're seeing, permits for broadband, lack of funding and financial capacity. The competing priorities is a really important one in terms of noticing, how do you take care of all of the portfolios for which you're responsible for? Non-conditional funding being important. I saw workforce development, skill development being a thing that came up a couple times as well. Funding from the province. Funding seems to be the recurrent theme, and boy, do we ever feel you on that one. So I totally understand. But the technical skills and lack of resources, if you were to get that funding, what would you do with it? I think these are all part of the same thing. MECP approvals, the regulatory burden of going through infrastructure and asset management. We've heard that from a number of people over the last year and a half, that the regulatory and reporting burden that goes into this often doesn't seem to match the output or the investment that goes with it. So these will continue to scale. And just for reference, we'll share this back out with Scott and the team. But we're capturing these responses and holding on to them so we can build them into our ongoing research. So thank you so much for contributing. Lack of past maintenance, absolutely. We're catching up with ourselves in terms of what we didn't invest in the past. And I think that's the overarching goal of this project, is to say, when you're not able to invest in or take advantage of opportunities that come up right now, how does that affect 5, 10, 25 years from now in terms of what we're able to do? Lack of broadband, and those who have seen me at OGR events before know that that's a particular pet issue of mine. But poor community engagement, all of these things are really important to take note of. So we'll move on to the next one, is what are your community's core infrastructure priorities and that are intended to support economic development? So when we're talking about those competing priorities, we're just going to ask you to rank these. And so you don't have to rank them in the order in which they appear here. You should have the option on your end to be able to rank them in terms of whatever is the highest priority for you and your community. But among what we've sort of classified as both core infrastructure and future-oriented infrastructure here, in terms of green infrastructure or initiatives aimed at climate resilience and similarity, or roads and bridges, broadband, energy, or social infrastructure, which in terms of housing or the leisure and recreation infrastructure that we look at in terms of supporting community life. So we'll let these go on for a little bit. But we're already seeing, kind of that core infrastructure taking a huge place, broadband kind of coming in second. It's a little bit like a horse race. So you can see this happen over time.
It's an OGRA audience, right? So it's a bit like Secretariat when you look at the core option there. We expect to be 30 lengths ahead of the field at the end of this. So.
And no surprise, right? When we look at core infrastructure in terms of roads and bridges and structures under, I believe it's structures under 3 meters. Am I getting my terminology right there? Tends to be what we've historically classified as core infrastructure for municipalities. Is the thing which municipalities are most responsible for, that has been a part of the portfolio for decades, if not centuries. And so understandably, it comes first. And we're seeing, actually, I thought it was really fascinating at the conference in February, just, in the immediate before times, before COVID, that the gravel roads maintenance session was really highly participated in, because we're seeing kind of that connection between funding, competing priorities, and the decommissioning of some roads to gravel, and what that means for communities. So not surprised by this at all. But it is really interesting to look at the ranking of priorities when we are seeing, particularly at a work done by Sean and Jay, that resilience to climate change and future shocks. I wouldn't be surprised if we did this in another kind of 5 years or so, that may inch higher because of the way in which we're talking about those things as being likely to contribute to future crises. So quite interesting that we often package energy and broadband together. However, what you're telling us is that really it's that core infrastructure, and then kind of broadband, and then social infrastructure, and then onwards from there. Really appreciate everyone sharing that with us. It really helps kind of frame some of the questions that we're going to ask. So recognizing that COVID-19 is going to affect the way you fund those competing priorities, how much do you anticipate your municipal budget being affected by COVID-19? So we have a few options here, which is I don't think it's going to affect it at all, reduced by 10, 25, 50, or more than 50%. And this is important when we talk about your capacity challenges that you listed earlier being primarily driven by funding, it sounded like. This will have a significant impact on how we're able to address those priority projects that we just talked about in the previous question. And the amount by which it has been reduced will affect the way that we're able to develop not only, responses to the immediate crisis, but will likely have impacts well beyond the COVID-19 recovery period. And the way we look at kind of framing those into the future is, how do we minimize the impacts of these things over time? So far we're seeing everyone responding that it will be affected in some way. We'll leave this up for a few more seconds, a couple more minutes. And nobody's telling us that they're A-okay, nothing's going to happen to them, which I was not expecting at all. But I was, you always hope that there might be a unicorn out there that somehow managed to plan better than the rest of us. But what we are seeing is that most of your communities will be significantly affected. So 0.25% of the budget, up to 25% of the budget. And that's quite significant when we think about projects that you may have been anticipating before all of this happened, and I tend to call it the before times, versus now here in the after times of COVID. And so this is quite important for us as we think about policy recommendations and how we're going to frame this research, and invite you to participate as we move forward. So we'll leave that for a couple more seconds.
On the unicorn side, there are some communities, there's a sweet spot that seems to be around 100,000 people with very dense forms that are largely built out, that are looking at scenarios where it's not quite as disastrous as they think, and are in fact looking at profits in some certain situations.
Wow. I think, again, highlighting just how big of a difference there is in terms of our assumed capacity of municipalities. And so
Right.
having this information is really important in terms of getting through those conversations, as both Ryan and Sean were saying, around kind of the urban situation of policymaking, around kind of the evidence that we have on hand that says, well, if there are a few that are doing, why aren't they all? But recognizing that the landscape is different for everybody is very important.
It's
So
not a
we'll
good time to own a transit system. That's
No, I guess not.
Yes.
It would be kind of difficult. So this one looks a little bit complicated, and I promise you it's far less complicated than it looks. We wanted to get a little bit of a gauge on where you anticipate that kind of budget hit happening, and so placing those in terms of high and low priority as well. So you'll see we have two things, and you'll need to rank each of these 6 things across whether you think there'll be more or less money available for them, and whether or not they're high or low priority to you and your community. So for example, if you anticipate that there won't be as much money available for roads and bridges, but those remain a very high priority for you, you would want to place them, high in the high priority and very low in the decreased, very far towards the decreased money available. If you, for example, anticipate that economic development supports will have more funding available to them through whatever program, from say federal funding or provincial funding, but they remain kind of a high or medium priority, you want to plot them there. So I'll give everybody a couple minutes to kind of think about those. And this kind of leads you in the direction of where we're going with this research. This question kind of hints at where we're heading down this road, which is the importance of finding ways for local governments to connect their infrastructure and asset management planning to economic development and longer term goals. So the way in which we prioritize those things, the way in which we frame how much funding or how much of finite resources are likely to be allocated towards those things. And then how do we plan for that? How do we put our minds around this and make policy decisions that recognize these kind of shifting priorities in context? So we're sort of seeing, you know, kind of core infrastructure being high priority and anticipating kind of a neutral effect on funding. Meanwhile, we're seeing kind of this this feeling that there'll be less funding available to support staff capacity. So, you know, we are seeing that across the country in terms of reduction in municipal labor forces coming down the line, and what that will mean for our local government's ability to seize opportunities as they come up. So being able to balance these things in and around each other becomes an important part of how we frame our research question. So we'll give folks a little bit more time to, and the best part about Mentimeter, right, is you can see as everybody inputs their results, things start to move and bounce around the screen. So this is all live and direct from your input. It's interesting to see where we see things like economic development, staff, green infrastructure, sort of a cluster of priorities that have increasingly become within the wheelhouse of local governments, but do not necessarily fall within the traditional responsibilities of local government, kind of grouping together there around that decreased funding available, but sort of maintaining the same priority. And again, Scott, you know, we're having the audience in question here, where we have kind of that core infrastructure maintaining its priority, but we are seeing everything grouped towards the understanding that be less funding available for all of those priorities. So thank you. And I promise I'll make a couple more questions.
Actually, afterwards, it'd be interesting. Some of the social infrastructure findings here are very interesting as well. I'd be interested to sort of hear from the attendees some of the pressures that they might be feeling in terms of maintaining those levels of service delivery. Services being, you know, so core to, you know, quality of life for people, people's willingness to sort of invest, attract, retain, those types of things. So that might be an interesting area of conversation following.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah,
So
we've been at OGRA, we've been sort of reimagining what infrastructure means in the 21st century, and we've been saying that social infrastructure is increasingly being understood as a fundamental aspect of community vitality and resiliency. COVID has, it's like attached a rocket to this idea. You know, the struggle to get any sort of headway or understanding on this issue has just exploded. And right now what we're seeing is, you know, I think if we were to do a poll of some sort asking if retirement homes would be a critical infrastructure asset right now, universally it would be a top priority, probably right up there beside your other core assets. So it's imposing a whole series of rethinks on the infrastructure sector more broadly, and it's interesting to see that I think people, the mood of the province, or at least of governments in the province, is certainly accurately reflected here. Everything's a priority and there's no money.
yeah, absolutely. And I think that's such an interesting point from both Sean and Scott is, I'll just note, just because it happened to be a portfolio I've worked in, is wasn't until 2016 that broadband was actually considered infrastructure in our federal and provincial budgets. And so something that's interesting to me is to see kind of that for a minute or two there, it's changed as people responded, that it was sort of in the same kind of categorization as the core infrastructure. And just as you're saying that, Scott, you know, this rethinking, what do we mean by infrastructure, and including that as a broad range of things, I think poses both a lot of challenges, but also opens up a lot of opportunities for particularly for rural communities to think about not only today, but the future as well, and those needs. So we'll move on to, there's only a couple more questions, and then we'll get on to sort of the other bulk of the research that we're doing with this project. But related to these previous questions was, you know, have you put any infrastructure projects or initiatives on hold as a result of the pandemic? So these could be things that were meant to happen kind of in March and April and just didn't happen, or things that you thought would be happening over the summer, but cannot due to particular circumstances. And this is sort of really driven by this idea that we've historically seen, infrastructure stimulus funding used as a way to get people to work, to put labor force kind of factors into the positive when a lot of people have been unemployed. And yet when the threat is a virus that really that limits our ability to do that, right? It limits our ability to put people in close working quarters, and so we have to be really thoughtful about that. So we wanted to know if this has affected things. So far, we've got kind of 8 people saying yes, and a couple of people saying we don't anticipate actually putting anything on hold. And then we have, just now we got a couple of people saying we haven't yet, but we're getting there, recognizing that even, things change kind of day by day, and even 3 months into this, every time I feel even personally that I've hit a new normal, something happens that throws me off kilter. So we know that municipalities are facing the same kind of organizational challenges, that as new things arrive, these will shift things. And so interestingly, most folks are responding that they have had to put something on hold. And maybe that's a thing that if you wanted to put that into the chat function, or to let us know the projects, what those projects were that you did put on hold related to COVID, that would be great information to have. We would love to know more about what those looked like, and maybe even some thoughts around what the impact of those would be. So we'll let this for a couple more seconds.
Anecdotally, it's interesting that we're seeing results here that align very closely to a similar initiative undertaken by the Canadian Urban Institute. That most communities are saying yes, they have, and then there's a fairly strong contingent that are saying not yet or no. So
yeah, it's an interesting balance.
In the chat section, you're seeing recreation projects and design projects are some of the broad fields that have been, or broader categories of projects that have been paused so far.
All right.
Road projects.
So, yeah. Sorry, Scott?
Sorry, no, there was Annette Gilchrist posted that road projects, one decreased in scope from 1 year to 3 years. An asset management plan for 2018, and another project just maintenance this year, not yet rescheduled. So there we go.
So this is our last question before I kind of talk a bit about some of the opportunities to participate in this project. Are, beyond COVID-19, how optimistic are you that your community is positioned to handle future shocks or crises? So we do unfortunately live in a context where we know that the pandemic is probably only the tip of an iceberg of shocks and crises that we're likely to see, whether they're economic, climate related, health related, and arguably all of those are interconnected and related to each other. And so in terms of being able to plan ahead and respond to those, just as we thought that maybe responding to previous epidemics and pandemics would have prepared us to handle COVID, we found out very quickly that was not the case. And we're very curious about folks' level of planning or thoughts for how all of this means that they'll be able to respond to future shocks. So we're seeing kind of in that mushy middle. Most folks are not, overly optimistic in terms of like not worried at all or totally underwater, but in that kind of, we've developed some strategies and we feel like we're in a good place, or folks that are worried and foresee major challenges ahead, but are not kind of in that analysis paralysis space that we tend to get to sometimes, which is everything is terrible and I can't do anything at all. So this is interesting and happy to see that. And I would also add that, if you would like to participate in sort of the opportunities that we'll have towards, that we'll share towards the end of this webinar around being featured as a bit of a case study, or to look at what you're doing, we'd love to know more about what those strategies are for those who are saying, we've developed good strategies and we feel like we're well positioned for what's coming down somewhere in the future. Jay will be sharing a little bit about his research on green infrastructure, and we do have some students within CEDRAD and myself who'll be doing some case studies around the ways that rural communities are dealing with these kinds of issues. So we would love to hear more from you. So this is our sort of our last question on the audience participation front. So we'll give you a couple more seconds to kind of get your input in. And then we'll move on to a bit more of the granular details about the Building the Future project, and some more sustained ways in which you can participate and share with us and help us build a solid evidence base for where we hope to go. So last couple thoughts coming in. All right. So how will we take kind of this kind of pulse check and some of the research that has been ongoing over the last year and a half, and where we're hoping to go? What are we going to do with that in order to build these evidence-based policy recommendations to support effective infrastructure investments and capacity building in rural communities? And this really speaks to what Sean and Ryan were speaking about at the top of the presentation around finding ways to contextualize the stories out of rural communities and to move from kind of anecdotal stories into more of an evidence base that gives policymakers a good understanding around what's actually happening in rural Canada and rural communities related to infrastructure and economic development, and ways in which we can move forward from there. So our core research questions, as Ryan said, are really around how are rural communities responding to infrastructure pressures and opportunities? How does that capacity vary? Going back to that point that just as there are multiple different urban contexts, there are multiple different rural contexts, and it's important that we capture a variety of those experiences so that we're not painting all rural communities as being a monolith. Secondary, how does that capacity or the lack thereof affect a community's current and future economic development opportunities? So this is actually going to be highlighted even further by the context we find ourselves in today related to COVID-19, because that connection between rural infrastructure and economic development is likely to feel a lot more immediate when we talk about getting people to work, around putting infrastructure in place that facilitates a different kind of thinking about community and social and economic development, and around moving into that question around what makes something shovel-worthy, as Sean mentioned before. So related to that, these are the things that we've heard so far from folks. So we've been at OGRA's conference twice now, getting some early feedback on the project and getting some participation there. And we've been working with rural community stakeholders across the province around these things, as well as digging into research that's already been done. And here are the things that we've heard so far, which is that there is a real optimism around rural community development, that there's a real possibility there for contributing to growth and affordability and quality of life. And even more so in the context of COVID-19, we're seeing kind of the dual-edged sword of what some people are calling disaster gentrification. So folks in urban environments kind of fleeing what they perceive as a connection between density and disease, which isn't actually all that accurate, but it's funny how our brains kind of seize on those things, and looking to move to more spacious or more open spaces in rural communities for a wide variety of reasons. And we see that after a lot of different crises, whether that's a hurricane or other major environmental storms or pandemics or disease in the past. We've seen this kind of shift in people out into the countryside. That does raise questions around who has the ability to do so and who can afford to do so, and what that means for housing stock and employment opportunities in rural communities, as well as pressures on the infrastructure. For those in the room who rely on seasonal tourism, we're seeing that in real time in terms of both the opportunities and challenges related to seasonal fluctuations in demand on infrastructure and economic opportunity. We've also heard that the lack of broadband infrastructure and natural gas are major impediments to rural economic development, and the current situation with COVID-19 has highlighted just how consequential that digital divide is, whether that's access to telehealth or education or the ability to work from home. This is not just a nice to have, it's now an important part of keeping people safe, as well as keeping people learning and employed and socially connected to each other. However, it remains a huge challenge for folks like you that are with us today to operationalize these connections and to move them into something that's more tangible and concrete in terms of budgetary lines and concrete strategies and action over time. For folks that were with me at OGRA this year in February, we did kind of a quick informal around the room poll of who had broadband on their economic development or official plan strategy, and almost every hand went up. And then when we asked, who had a budget line for broadband in their municipal budget, I think we only had one or two. So this kind of tangible connection between what we value and what's an important part of strategy and how we get there becomes something that's challenging as well. Further, we know that working collaboratively with regional partners, whether that's other municipalities, First Nations, or other organizations, is something that municipalities find challenging in both regulatory and operational ways, but also something that rural communities would like to explore in more creative ways. But there's a lack of support for figuring out the way to do that that feels respectful and good for all parties involved. So we want to learn from you in terms of what these capacities are, and we've said these research questions previously, but we're really turning it to you folks who are with us in the room, and OGRA members and folks across Ontario, to really find out what's going on. And in order to do that, we need your help. So in partnership with OGRA, and thank you to our amazing partners at Good Roads for their continued support and involvement in this project, as well as the Ontario Agri-Food Innovation Alliance for supporting and funding the project. We have a survey, which I know everyone's probably in survey fatigue, but we did launch this actually at OGRA in late February, and then kind of, well, everything happened, didn't it? So we're trying to recognize that the world has likely changed tremendously for you individually and for your community since late February and now. We didn't expect anyone to be filling it out during that time period. And so now we would like, we'd like hopefully to think that maybe when you have a moment to breathe, that you might be able to contribute some of your responses in a meaningful way. So you can access that survey at the link that's included there. And I will note that that's a case sensitive link, so you need to enter it exactly as it's written there, but it will take you to what is a fairly involved survey around the connection between infrastructure investment and economic development. We're wanting whoever wants to participate to participate. We're primarily launching this towards municipalities, and so we would like CAOs as well as elected officials to complete it, managers of transportation, economic development officers. As many people involved in your community as want to take the survey can take the survey. It's not limited to one voice from your municipality. And that speaks to our comment earlier that we know that there'll be different thoughts emerging depending on the role that you occupy. The survey will be available until August 10th, so you have a good 6 weeks to kind of come at it and respond to it. You don't have to complete it all in one fell swoop. You can take your time and complete it in stages. I will note that if you don't finish your survey within a month, it'll just record what you've inputted so far and take those as your answers. So try not to leave it for too long, but you can take your time to complete the survey. I recognize for sure that everyone is maybe feeling a little bit of survey fatigue, but in terms of contributing to the kind of research and policy recommendations that we'd like to develop, this is really important that we get strong participation. So please share widely with your networks, with folks that work in municipalities in Ontario. Additionally, I'm going to turn it over to Jay to talk a little bit about some of the more specific case study research that he's hoping to do as part of his research as well.
Thanks, Ashley. So yeah, as a kind of next step following the survey with our project, we're doing some deep dive case studies to get some more in-depth knowledge of what's going on in communities. And I'm interested specifically in sort of the green infrastructure aspects of infrastructure development and its connection to the economy and community resilience. So when I say green infrastructure, there's some variation in definitions around that, but I'm interested particularly in natural infrastructures or nature-based infrastructures, which served, they're not necessarily a new idea. We've used natural infrastructure for a long time, and we get a lot of benefits from natural systems through processes like water filtration and recreation benefits, resources from the natural environment. So rural communities in particular have relied on these sorts of resources for a long time, but the idea with green infrastructure is just reframing the way we think about and plan around sort of the natural environment and green spaces in our communities, so that we can better prioritize the values and the benefits that we receive from these systems. So the picture on the right here just shows some of the sort of natural elements within a rural community in Ontario that we derive benefits from. And some of these benefits can be core infrastructure benefits, like I mentioned, with wetlands and forests that provide us with water filtration and help us deliver clean drinking water to residents and manage stormwater as it leaves our hard surfaces. But we also can think about these systems in sort of a holistic approach that we get more benefits than just the basic infrastructure function that they might provide. So if we're framing them in these ways, it opens up a lot of possibilities to just make the most out of the resources that we have in our communities. And natural amenities like this in rural communities are particularly valuable, where we tend to have more limiting capacities in staffing and funding, as many of you mentioned. So if we can use these assets that are already present in our communities in a really strategic way to get the maximum benefit out of them, and it'll save us money in terms of infrastructure investment and add to overall community livability and just a whole suite of multifunctional benefits, including economic development, in the sense that these assets make rural communities unique and very attractive and pleasant places to live. So for my case work, I'm looking for good examples of where communities have taken strategies to kind of make the most out of their natural assets and their green infrastructure, and recognizing that this isn't necessarily a common terminology or common approach to planning in all areas, and particularly rural areas. So any planning and development work that's gone on around the natural environment and making use of natural systems to supply community services is of interest to me. And through this, I'm hoping to get a better understanding of how this is impacting rural communities' economic development, their resiliency, and what this looks like for kind of the governance and collaboration around making use of these natural resources. And I am hoping to gear up for my case research by the end of July. So prior to the end of the survey, which I imagine will shed a lot of light and good examples will come out of there, hopefully. But because I'm hoping to get rolling a little bit sooner, if you know of or have experience with this type of development planning and good examples of green infrastructure from your own communities, I'd love it if you share them with me. And my email is there at the bottom, and I imagine we can circulate it after the webinar too, with our sort of follow-up slides and information.
That's great. Thanks, Jay. And I'll turn it back over to Ryan to talk a little bit more about what's coming down the pipe.
Yeah, so we're really excited to relaunch the survey and looking forward to everybody's contributions. And so please make sure to bookmark that web link or pass it along to your colleagues on that front so that we can get those contributions. But there are, as Jay was mentioning, a series of other activities that are taking place in this project. And I see some great comments coming into the chat box there from Annette around a potential example of regional collaboration in Ottawa County and Renfrew. But we have Jay's work around green infrastructure. Ashley's also doing some really interesting work around place-based development and infrastructure innovations. And do you want to give maybe a quick shout on that, Ashley, of what you're up to?
Sure. So I'm working on some stuff around a comparative case study between here in Canada and Scotland around place-based innovation. And part of that framing is kind of conversations around future-oriented investments in infrastructure. So for those of you who are planning down the road, please get in touch. We'd love to put them into some greater context around those. I've done some vignettes around what's happening in Scandinavia and in Scotland from some previous fieldwork, so there'll be some small cases coming out shortly to go with some of the results from the survey. But please do get in touch if you're doing anything in the space related to broadband or to holistic planning related to the future, and things that really support your unique place. That would be wonderful, and I'd love to talk to you.
That's great. And in addition to that, we also have some other vignettes, short stories that will be coming out from across both here in Ontario as well as outside of Ontario. And many of these started to emerge from the discussions that we were having at the OGRA conference over the past 2 years, where communities said, you know, this is something that's really cool. Either they're doing it or they'd like to know more about other communities that have been doing things. So please don't hesitate to send in any suggestions along that front, as we would love to incorporate that information into the grand project so that we can make sure that the recommendations that are put forward are going to be useful at the end of the day. And I think just the last piece here is, as we think about there are next steps, we're hoping they become your next steps as well, that you'll help us along the way in terms of some of the things that we're doing, because they're incredibly important. We know that infrastructure investments are front and center in our discussions at the moment, and we want to make sure that we're using those investments strategically. We also know that there's not a whole lot of information out there at the moment, so we want to try to capture the best amount of evidence, the experiences, the insights from people that are living this reality so that we can convey that to decision makers. And at the end of the day, we're hoping that not only have you recorded the hyperlink for the survey, but you'll encourage others to complete it as well, whether that is staff within your organization or among elected officials, because the more perspectives we can gather, the better on that side of things. So I'm going to leave it there, Scott. The website is there for more information. Ashley and my email addresses are there. Jay's was up before, but open to questions if people have them, whether it's through the Q&A or the chat. But we'd love to hear whether it's your opinions, your reflections of this information, or potential case studies or interesting innovations that have taken place.
So just to reiterate the appeal that you just heard there moments ago, you'll be hearing from OGRA directly, asking for your participation in this study. We see this as a vital tool that's going to inform a lot of decision making in the infrastructure realm amongst local government moving forward. So keep your eyes peeled to your inboxes. That should be coming, I believe, early next week. Few questions. If there are other questions folks have that they want to pose in the Q&A module, by all means, feel free to do so. We've talked about shovel-worthy versus shovel-ready, the various competing schools of thought there. I'm wondering if I gave the panel a magic wand to design an infrastructure program, say a post-COVID stimulus program that would work to the advantage of rural communities, what would be the key principles? What would be the top priority you'd want to see incorporated into that program? Ashley, I'll start with you.
Well, I was going to deflect to Sean. So I was going to say that we've actually through the Canadian Rural Revitalization Foundation, there's been a number of scholars, including folks that are here on this on the panel today. Actually, all three of them, who've contributed to a series of what we're calling Rural Insight series related to exactly what you're saying. You know, what are the different magic wands and what they look like? So I would direct some folks to look at some of those resources, and they really focus on everything from economic development to a newly released one actually on green infrastructure, which includes the four of us, as well as Dr. Paul Kraling and Cassia Tolsma from SFU. So I would direct folks to look at a number of those issue-specific ones. My magic wand would be to think about these things holistically. So I think that the more that we can connect all of the ways in which we do planning or infrastructure, environmental or otherwise, is to recognize that they're all connected to the same thread. So moving to shovel-worthy means looking at things not just in their individual silo, but how they connect to health, to economic development, to social development, to quality of life, rather than just making sure a road is serviceable for us to drive on. So the more that we can think about those things in a holistic manner, in a way that augments the features and the qualities of our communities that we do want to see thrive in the future, the better off we'll be. But the shovel-worthy quote goes directly to Sean. That's his brilliance. So I will turn over the pass the buck that way.
I can pick that up, Ashley. Your answers were excellent. It's a great question, Scott. And first principle would be, really deep and intense consultation and engagement with rural communities themselves in terms of identifying what those priorities are. The knowledge gap that I was talking about in terms of policy actors, in terms of conditions and what's actually happening in the rural landscape, because of a lack of investment in rural regions, I think is particularly painful right now. So, certainly that's one of the positive things about this project in terms of being able to quickly translate knowledge and transfer knowledge about what's happening in the rural landscape to policymakers so that they're designing those programs and policies appropriately to be of greatest benefit is probably the most important thing. In terms of the shovel-worthy piece, I think, we're looking at a few things. One is, it's interesting to your point around how COVID has just sort of exposed different fractures and gaps in our infrastructure systems, our social infrastructure systems. So there, new things may have come to light that we may not have been prioritizing to the same extent. But, in terms of looking for that long-term legacy value, what's going to enhance and improve the quality of life for your community, for the people that live there, for the residents who want to live there and invest there, and your ability to attract and retain residents going forward. Those are very, very good investments that we could look at, and they don't necessarily make the top priority list from a government perspective. The other aspect would be, the cost of maintaining and sustaining infrastructure going into the future. As we look at adaptation to climate change, what type of infrastructure systems will yield better cost advantages for you going into the future? So if there's an opportunity to make upfront costs in different energy systems, housing retrofits, building retrofits, these types of things, how can we make the cost burden for rural communities going forward much more advantageous and favorable? I think that may also provide some useful advantages to rural communities, particularly if we enter a period of austerity budgets following the crisis. That's not guaranteed. We can make sort of ideological decisions to grow out of the deficits that we've been accumulating. But nevertheless, how can we put in place infrastructure that's more cost effective and allowing communities to adapt to climate change going into the future in a more cost-effective manner?
Okay, the clock is really working against us here, but I did want to, there were a couple more questions I wanted to put to the panel. We referenced that adage, if you've been to one rural community, you've been to one rural community. I think there's a well understood tension between rural communities and urban communities, but we don't often talk about the sort of micro-regionalism amongst rural communities themselves. To what extent do you think that sort of lack of coordination horizontally amongst lower tier communities, amongst rural communities, between rural communities and sometimes neighboring indigenous communities has hindered the maintenance and stewardship of infrastructure assets? Ryan, you're from Northern Ontario, or from Northern Manitoba, you get to start with this one.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it's one that I've been kind of watching the local newspapers across Ontario and across the country, especially in areas where we saw kind of historically communities didn't work well with each other for whatever reason, whether it was that they cheated in the hockey game 20 years ago or whatever might have been the reason for why they don't work together. And we're starting to see communities looking at things at a regional level, because many of the priorities that were mentioned in the poll that were just happened in this presentation are common across many of these communities, and the available resources that are available to tackle these are often increasingly hindered in terms of their ability to deliver. And so regional work might be one of those solutions where things can be co-designed, co-delivered, co-managed at the end of the day. But all of that's predicated on a goodwill of trust, a good relationship between them. And that becomes challenging because our current political system largely means that if you're elected a mayor of a community, you're elected to defend the interest of your community. And that doesn't necessarily work well when it comes to thinking about things differently around regional infrastructure or regional economic development. But it's exciting to start thinking about where that is working. And I think Annette shared one with the rail that system that had been developed out in Ottawa and Renfrew. And these, I think, are increasingly common. And I think a lot of other communities are also looking at how that's working and how they might structure it for themselves.
Okay, this takes us exactly to 1 minute beyond our scheduled time. So I'd like to think that this is an indication of good planning, but if that was the case, I have no involvement in it. I want to thank each and every one of you for taking the time to share your insights and your experience with us today. Like I said, I think it was an uplifting conversation and a good entry point into what will hopefully be a long and restorative summer. So again, we'll be distributing some of the material referenced today in the coming weeks. If you have questions, certainly you can get a hold of the folks at OGRA or any of the researchers who've been presenting today directly. Again, thank you. Stay safe, everyone, and enjoy your time. Bye-bye.